by both the government and the marketplace. The actions by the government, some of which are, in the works, is to try to lean on holders of the debt, such as foreign countries and so on, to buy debt and to not sell their debt. Another thing will be to shorten the maturities of the debt. When things get bad, there might be capital controls, and most likely there'll be the central bank coming in and buying a lot of the debt, which will depreciate the value of the money. So you would see that in the form of the dollar going down, but also other currencies because they have their problems going down, gold prices going up. It would be something like, if you take the late 70s, when we had then the world was operating under a gold standard, which was created in 1944 at the end of World War II, when they had to define what was the monetary order, how would the system work. And that was gold backed the money, or it was actually thought of differently. They thought gold was money. And all the money that we think of today, like fiat currency, was like checks in a checkbook that you would then turn in to get your money. But when the checks in the checkbook or the checks outstanding were much greater than the gold in the bank, the real money in the bank, and there was a turning in of that, and they couldn't cover it like all bank crisis is. There's not enough money in the bank and they wanted it. Then there was a pause in that, a breaking of that promise to get the real money. So the bank, in this case, the central bank, defaulted and devalued and printed money so everybody would get their money. And that's why we had the stagflation period of the 1970s. The exact same thing happened in the 1930s. So on August 15th, 1971, President Nixon got on the television and announced that change in the monetary policy, that breakdown of the monetary policy and going to a fiat monetary policy. In March of 1933, President Roosevelt got on the radio and announced this exact same policy because there wasn't enough hard money, not enough gold. And so that's what it looks like. This has happened throughout history in all countries, all times. The basic issue is, what is money and what is debt? Debt is a promise to deliver money. And is that money hard money that actually gets delivered on? Or is that money fiat money or printed money that doesn't get delivered on? But if you go back through all history repeatedly, you always see that. I can recount the times. 1971 was a good example of the breakdown of the monetary system when we went from promises to deliver gold that were defaulted on, and then we went to a fiat monetary system. All countries throughout all time have dealt with this. And the reason I wanted to write the book is I wanted to show very, very clearly the mechanics and symptoms of this problem so that one could understand it mechanistically and measure it, because we can measure it right now. For example, in the U.S., if you want, I'll take you through what the numbers are, but it's important. The government will spend about $7 trillion, and it will take in about $5 trillion. So it will spend 40% more than it's taking in, and it really can't cut expenditures much. Having done a lot of that, the debt is now about 6 times the amount of money it takes in. The amount of money that it has to come up with for next year is $12 trillion. And that amount of essentially debt it has to sell. That comes $1 trillion about, which is half our budget deficit, goes to interest. $9 trillion have to be rolled forward. It's maturing. And then we'll sell an additional 2 trillion. So you have to sell a lot of debt. We're now at a point where there will be an adding to a lot of debt at a point that's close to the edge. Because as we add to that debt, then those numbers and that supply demand picture worsen past the point really of being able to rectify it. So, because then what do you do? I was in Washington and speaking with top people on both parties, and the problem is really a political problem. In the book, I explained that if there was a cut in the budget deficit to about 3% of GDP, which could happen in three ways, that they could stabilize the debt where it is. And those three ways of cutting the budget deficit to about 3% of GDP would be basically equally in taxes and in spending, which would be in total amount taxes, total amount of spending would be probably a 4% increase in taxes and a 4% decrease in spending. That wouldn't quite get you there. But what it would do is improve the supply demand picture of the debt so that interest rates would come down, and interest rates coming down would be good for debt service payments because so much goes to interest. That's why interest is so important. But you can't force interest rates unnaturally down because then it discourages the holding of debt assets because it makes it a bad deal for the creditor to hold those assets. The reaction, everybody I spoke to agreed with the numbers and the mechanics. And I've spoken to most Federal Reserve heads and other central bank heads and Treasury secretaries, and there's agreement about that. The reason I say it's political is that the answer that I got back from those in Washington who were dealing with it is that they say, Ray, you have to understand that we have to make at least one, maybe two promises. And those promises are, first, I promise not to raise your taxes. And second, I promise not to cut your benefits in order to get elected. And so that's where we are on the financial conditions, I would say, in the United States. I think those two are reasonable. I think here's the problem, and I found that that everybody's into their particulars, and they argue so much about the particulars. It's like being on a boat that everybody agrees is going to hit the rocks, and that they need to turn the boat, but they can't agree whether to turn it left or right because they're so hung up on their particulars that. So, like I believe, take the 3% pledge. If you can't agree on what to do, then do it proportionately. I don't really care. Get there, okay? So, like we can get into that, but I think please take the 3% pledge. Agree to do it proportionately, or find some way that you do it. Because otherwise, the arguing about it is going to lead us to hit the rocks. It's likely to be too late. To be specific, what's going to happen, they will soon start to talk about 26, and 26 is a midterm election year. And so it won't be until after 26 that the best you can hope for is a bipartisan commission in which both sides approach the question, and hopefully smart people then choose to do their engineering and their political negotiating to come up with a plan that probably, won't be put into place because commissions don't work that well, or if it does, will be put in awfully late. So we're all just playing with ourselves when we think about this idea of which one it should be rather than dealing with which things that there should be. There are all sorts of things that in particulars which we can digress into that can be done. I mean, just at the big picture, just figure it like, can you do 4% one way or another in taxes? And if you had to do everything across the board because you couldn't agree on anything, could you do that? Could you do 4% on spending? Could you do that? Even looking at that question of whether you could do that is interesting because there are some things that cannot be changed. Or, like what are you going to do on some things? But to start to look at it that way, and then you can go on to, is this thing better than the other thing? But I can't be optimistic. First of all, I don't get frustrated. I'm just analytical.
Fair enough.
I'm just, it is what it is, and different people have different perspectives. And I would say I think that the problems are very well recognized, and that the administration's point of view is that these things are problems. So you have a renovation plan that they have, which is tariffs will bring in tax revenue, and they are bringing in big tax revenue, and that will protect American businesses in various ways, and help in the budget deficit. And they would say that stimulation is required to raise the incomes to create the tax, just like Scott had mentioned. The best way to get out of this is through stimulation and taxation, and then leaning on other countries in various ways, partially to pay their expenses, to help to cut our expenses, and to encourage them, with a big E under encourage, them to invest in the United States and buy our debt. So I'm very nonpartisan. Okay. I'm just trying to be analytical. And I convey my pictures of these things as accurately as I can. And I wouldn't do justice to our discussion if I didn't convey that perspective. I don't think it's going to get us there. I think there are some aspects to it that have a lot of merit, and there are lots of aspects to it that I would disagree with. And I think the real problem of our country right now is the breakdown of the effectiveness of democracy.
Could you say more about that?
I want to preface it with something. I'm a practical guy. I'm not an academic, and but I've studied history. The first time that about the 1971 breakdown of the monetary system, I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and I thought when Nixon made that announcement that that was going to cause a crisis. I went on the floor of the stock exchange, and I saw the stock market up more than it was in decades, and that led me to study the prior devaluations. I never saw one of those before. And I learned that in March 1933, Roosevelt made the same move. And I understood more of the mechanics of all of this. And that also led me to understand how the debt problem existed, that allowed me to anticipate the 2008 financial crisis and the 2010 to 15 European financial crisis, and do very well during that period. I would say that there are five main forces that interact to drive everything. We're talking about the debt mechanics. There is also a political mechanics that enters into this, the battle between the left and the right. And when you get into a situation where there are irreconcilable differences, then the system classically creates a type of great internal conflict in which the system itself is in jeopardy. Okay. Democracy, one of the big problems of democracy is people vote for what they want, and you can't maybe necessarily do what's best for them sometimes. And we are now at a stage where we have irreconcilable differences. And so, how our system is working and the moves that we're seeing politically to get control, to get control, remind me very much of the 1930s, as does this debt situation. The third, as I said, there are five. The third great force that has a big effect is the international geopolitical world order. The way it works is who's in control of the order, the system, the world system. It's always the powerful country. So in 1945, the winners of the war set the rules. And the United States was the dominant power, had 80% of the world's money, gold, half the world's. Anyway, it set the rules. Then what happens is rising powers challenge the existing powers, and there's no world court that resolves these things. And so you have a great conflict. And that requires military spending. That requires that, these actions. So we are, as you can see, as you watch in Beijing, Xi and Putin and Modi and the military parade. Okay, this is all part of the picture. And so it enters into even the economic policy. Tariffs, one of the purposes of tariffs is to get independence, because you need self-sufficiency in a world where you may be cut off, or we might be cutting others off in certain type of war, and that's financial. So that's the third influence. The fourth influence throughout history has been acts of nature. Droughts, floods, and pandemics have killed more people than wars, and it's a factor. And it's a big factor now, and it's costly. It's estimated that the cost of that will be about $8 trillion a year for the world, and a world GDP that's $100 trillion. That's a lot of money. And then number five in the force has always been technology. In other words, man's inventiveness of technologies have been revolutionary and raised living standards as reflected in life expectancy, GDP per capita, and so on. And now we can't have this conversation without talking about technology changes on this whole picture. Because now with artificial intelligence and so on, does that create productivity miracles that help to make that problem less of a problem? And what does it all mean? So all five of those forces are interacting to create the dynamic that we now have, and also raise a lot of question marks, because this is not a precise, none of those things really can be thought through so precisely.
Gold and silver have once again captured the spotlight as America teeters on the edge of unprecedented financial and political instability. With Donald Trump's recent surge in polling numbers despite multiple legal challenges, and the U.S. economy walking a tightrope of inflation, rate uncertainty, and record-breaking debt levels, it has become abundantly clear that the fiat system, rooted in endless money printing and blind trust, is broken. Gold and silver are not just alternative investments anymore. They are lifeboats in a storm of economic and institutional collapse. Every fiat currency in history has eventually failed. The US dollar, once backed by gold, now floats on the whims of policymakers and central bankers. The Federal Reserve claims to fight inflation, yet it created the very problem with years of near-zero interest rates and trillions in stimulus. And now, with CPI inflation numbers still sticky and consumer sentiment in freefall, they've cornered themselves into a lose-lose situation. Raise rates and tank the economy, or ease and ignite another inflation wave. Either way, fiat suffers, but physical gold and silver, finite, real, and time-tested, thrive. In the last few weeks, silver has quietly outperformed many other assets, pushing past key resistance levels while being largely ignored by the mainstream media. Gold, too, is testing all-time highs amid global central bank accumulation. Why are nations like China, Russia, and even Poland buying tons of gold while telling their citizens to hold cash? Because they know what's coming. They know the dollar is losing its dominance and that the next financial system won't be built on paper IOUs. It will be anchored to something real. Trump's return to the headlines isn't just about politics, it's about economic sentiment. His recent statements slamming the Federal Reserve and calling for a return to sound money are echoing louder than ever. Trump understands that Americans are losing faith in the institutions that manage their money. Confidence in the Fed is near all-time lows. The Treasury is issuing debt at a breakneck pace. Social Security is on track to go bankrupt. Meanwhile, the stock market continues to float on speculation, artificially supported by Fed jawboning and tech hype. But beneath the surface, cracks are forming. Young investors are waking up. They're beginning to see the trap. Save in dollars, and you're guaranteed to lose purchasing power. Trust in stocks and crypto, and you're subject to manipulation and regulatory whims. The only assets with a 5,000-year track record of preserving wealth through every war, recession, and regime change are gold and silver. And right now, silver is arguably the most undervalued strategic asset on Earth. Not only is it a monetary metal, but it's also essential in solar panels, electric vehicles, and industrial applications. The supply is shrinking while demand is surging. This is not a speculative narrative. It's a supply chain reality. Meanwhile, America is sleepwalking into another debt crisis. With over $34 trillion in national debt and interest payments now rivaling military spending, the writing is on the wall. The government has no plan to pay it off. The only tool they have left is inflation. Silent theft through currency debasement. If you're holding dollars, you're the victim. Every printed dollar makes your savings weaker. Every stimulus check, every bailout, every new government program funded by the printing press, it's a transfer of your wealth to the state. Look at the banks. Regional banking stress has returned, and big names are warning of a new wave of collapses. If even one major institution falls, a domino effect could ensue. And with FDIC reserves under pressure and trust in banks declining, people are beginning to ask serious questions. What happens to my savings if the system locks up? If you can't hold it, you don't own it, and that's why physical metals are making a comeback. Gold and silver require no counterparty. They cannot be hacked, frozen, or inflated away. They don't rely on government promises or Wall Street gymnastics. In times of war, regime change, or collapse, like the world is inching toward now, they are the final fallback. Just this week, Trump warned that America is closer than ever to losing the dollar as the world reserve currency. That's not alarmism, it's fact. The BRICS nations are actively developing a gold-backed trading currency, and the world is watching. The petrodollar era is ending, and with it, the dollar's dominance. Gold and silver will outlive fiat. They have outlived every empire that thought it could print its way to prosperity, and they will outlive this one too. While Wall Street distracts you with AI stocks and debt-fueled bubbles, the smart money is quietly accumulating hard assets. If the monetary system resets, and history shows it always does, those holding metals will have purchasing power while everyone else scrambles for crumbs.